The great halls of Fushimi were silent on the morning after Hideyoshi's death, as if the weight of his absence had drained the air from the palace itself. Outside, the cicadas screamed beneath a pale autumn sun, oblivious to the empire holding its breath. Inside, incense hung in stagnant clouds over polished cedar floors. The once mighty Taiko, who had bent all of Japan to his will, now lay still within a silk-draped bier. Yet the faint cry of a child echoed through the corridors, thin and wavering like a reed in the wind. It was the only living sound among the dead grandeur. And somewhere behind a screen, a man stood barefoot on the cold wood, staring toward that cry as though he could see the future unraveling from its fragile throat. His name was Ishida Mitsunari, and he knew the child's life would summon wolves. Cha-Cha knelt beside the small boy, her hair unbound, her ceremonial robes pooling around her like a tide gone slack. They called her Yodo-dono now, consort of the great Hideyoshi, but she still felt the name Cha-Cha coiled like a ghost inside her. The daughter of a defeated lord, the niece of a woman driven to suicide, the woman who had survived only by surrendering herself to the man now lying cold behind her. She held her son's tiny wrist, feeling the flutter of his pulse, and wondered how long it would be before someone came to kill him. Outside these walls, the samurai lords who had bowed to Hideyoshi's iron will now sharpen their swords with quiet eagerness, and the most dangerous among them was already circling. Tokugawa Ieyasu smiled at the funeral with the patience of a stone. Mitsunari watched him from across the courtyard as the rites began. To most of the men assembled, he was nothing more than a pale-faced clerk, a man of ink pots and scrolls. They mocked his soft voice, his thin frame, his obsession with order. But in this hollow hour when Hideyoshi's empire trembled on its foundations, Mitsunari's mind ran like a taut bowstring. He could see the pieces shifting. The old General Maeda was dying. The brash warriors Kato Kayomasa and Fukushima Masanori hated him enough to draw steel in the council chamber. Yet he alone knew how to keep the machine running. Hideyoshi had trusted him to move armies like clockwork, to feed them, clothe them, make them appear where they were needed as if by magic. Now without him, everything would fly apart. And if it did, the first to be crushed would be the boy. As incense coiled toward the rafters, Mitsunari's gaze kept drifting to Cha-Cha. She sat still as carved jade, but her eyes were fixed on the shrouded bier, like someone watching the sun set on the world. He remembered the day she first came to Hideyoshi's court, the proud daughter of Azai Nagamasa, forced to kneel before the man who had destroyed her family. She had endured it all: court whispers, the scorn of senior retainers, the suffocating rituals of the palace, until Hideyoshi, long denied a male heir, placed their newborn son in her arms and called him salvation. Now that child was the last thread holding the Toyotomi legacy together, and Mitsunari understood, with a clarity that chilled him, that the thread was already fraying. The funeral ended as the sun bled toward the western hills, and the generals scattered like crows from a corpse. Mitsunari walked alone through the twilight garden, the gravel crunching beneath his sandals. He had served Hideyoshi for 2 decades, rising from a temple novice in Omi province to a magistrate of provinces and castles, wielding the invisible power of numbers and grain. He had never sought glory, only order. But glory was the language of the age, and men like Ieyasu spoke it fluently. They had steel in their blood. Mitsunari had only paper. Yet he also had something they did not, a mind that never stopped assembling the future. He reached the covered bridge leading back to his quarters and paused. Beyond the eaves, the moon lifted itself over Kyoto like a blade. Mitsunari thought of the armies still stationed in Korea, of the daimyo already slipping their leashes, of the council of 5 elders created to govern until Hideyori came of age. A council Ieyasu would dominate unless someone stopped him. The boy was 3 years old. He could not speak for himself. Cha-Cha could not lead armies. The other magistrates were too cautious, too splintered, too eager to survive. Only Mitsunari had the resolve, though he knew resolve alone might kill him. In her private chamber, Cha-Cha sat awake long after the attendants withdrew. The autumn wind rattled the screens. She stared at the sleeping boy beside her and felt the shape of her life collapsing inward. She had been born in a fortress at Odani, cradled in silk while her father defied Oda Nobunaga. She had watched that fortress burn, Her mother flee, her father die. She had spent her youth in the gilded cage of Asuchi, and later the cold shadows of Hideyoshi's palaces. She had known how to survive by becoming beautiful stone, unyielding, unreadable, untouchable. But stone could not protect a child from blades. She thought of Mitsunari, his pinched expression and relentless precision, the way he spoke as though reciting equations. She had once dismissed him as another of Hideyoshi's tools, useful but bloodless. Yet she had seen something in his eyes during the funeral, not grief but calculation edged with fear. He understood what she now understood. The boy was a lamb among wolves. And so, for the first time, she considered trusting someone not for love nor duty, but for necessity. In the days that followed, the palace shifted like a cracked mask. Tokugawa Ieyasu summoned the other elders to secret councils, his retainers flooding Kyoto's streets. Kato and Fukushima openly mocked Mitsunari, daring him to protest. He remained silent, sending coded letters to loyalists in Sawayama and Kyoto, gathering what strands of authority remained. Cha-Cha rarely left her chambers, but behind her doors she watched everything. She noted who bowed too low to Ieyasu, who avoided her eyes, who hesitated when her son's name was spoken. Her isolation became armor. At night she walked the corridors where Hideyoshi's banners still hung, their golden gourds dulled by dust. She passed the empty banquet halls where once the air had trembled with laughter and the clatter of cups, where Hideyoshi had danced on the tables in his armor to celebrate the unification of Japan. Now those halls were hollow, echoing only with the soft scurry of mice. The empire he had forged in fire had turned to ash in less than a season, and yet beneath the ruin, a strange thing began to grow. Cha-Cha found her thoughts circling Mitsunari, that thin shadow gliding tirelessly from chamber to chamber. He had no poetry in him, no warmth, yet he moved with an almost unbearable purpose, as though the collapse of the world was merely another logistical problem to solve. She began to see him not as weak, but as dangerous, the kind of danger born not of strength, but of conviction. By late winter, the shape of the coming struggle had emerged in her mind like a mountain through mist. Ieyasu would not wait for Hideyori to grow. He would consume the Toyotomi legacy piece by piece, under the guise of guardianship, until nothing remained. The other elders would watch and do nothing. The daimyo of the West would bend their knees to Tokugawa gold. The boy would live long enough only to remember his father's name before it was erased. Unless someone defied the current, unless someone was willing to drown for him. Cha-Cha placed her hand on the boy's chest as he slept, feeling the frail flutter of his heart. She remembered the funeral, the hush, the cries of the child, and Mitsunari's eyes cutting through the incense haze like cold glass. In that moment, a silent accord had passed between them, though no word was spoken. She would preserve the boy's blood, and Mitsunari would preserve his world. Beyond the palace, snow began to fall over the silent gardens of Fushimi, blanketing the stones like ash. The empire lay still, as though holding its breath. Somewhere in the darkness, Mitsunari's brush scratched across paper, drafting new orders, new alliances, new illusions to hold the crumbling edifice together. He did not yet know that this choice would lead him to the misty fields of Sekigahara, to betrayal and ruin. He only knew that he could not allow the child to die. And so in the frozen shadow of a dead empire, the fates of Ishida Mitsunari and Cha-Cha entwined. Two unlikely souls, one born of ink and the other of fire, standing alone between a helpless boy and the hunger of history. Long before the halls of Fushimi fell silent, Ishida Mitsunari had walked the world as a ghost among men. He was born in the gentle folds of Omi province around 1560, a land of low hills and mirror-still lakes where the winds carried the sound of temple bells from mountain to mountain. His family were minor retainers, holding a small patch of land that could barely feed itself. The age he entered was drenched in blood. Japan was a patchwork of warlords, each clawing for supremacy, each leaving villages smoking behind them. Boys his age played in the mud while watching armored men pass like gods. But Mitsunari did not play. He counted. He studied the rhythm of footsteps, the number of spears, the pattern of banners. He saw the world not as chaos, but as an intricate puzzle waiting to be solved. At a temple near Lake Biwa, The young Mitsunari found refuge in books. The monks recognized his sharpness and gave him scrolls older than his family name. He learned the Confucian classics, the laws of taxation, the ledgers of grain. He wrote in characters so small and exact they looked carved into the page. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with the certainty of numbers. To him, war was only the failure of logistics. Armies starved because men forgot to count sacks of rice. Cities fell because someone miscalculated the flow of silver. While other boys dreamed of swords, he dreamed of balance sheets. This strange boy of numbers caught the attention of Toyotomi Hideyoshi when fate swept him through Omi. Hideyoshi, the brilliant upstart who had risen from peasant stock to become Nobunaga's general, saw in Mitsunari a mind that could turn chaos into order. He took him as a tea server, a post that seemed menial but allowed Mitsunari to whisper figures into his ear while pouring the fragrant green liquid. When Hideyoshi asked how many koku of rice were left to feed the troops at Nagahama, Mitsunari answered without hesitation. When he asked how far a column could march before the horses collapsed, Mitsunari produced the number as if plucking it from the air. Soon Hideyoshi brought him into the war council, and from that day forward, Mitsunari stopped being a shadow and became the unseen engine of an empire. Yet while Mitsunari was shaping himself into a weapon of order, Cha-Cha was learning how survival demanded surrender. She had been born in 1569, the first daughter of Azai Nagamasa and Oichi, in the cold stone fortress of Odani. The walls were thick and the banners bright, but her childhood was etched with the tension of men who knew they were doomed. Nagamasa had defied Oda Nobunaga, and Nobunaga was not a man who forgave. When the armies came in 1573, the hills shook with fire. Cha-Cha was 4 years old when the sky turned black. She remembered running through corridors of flame, the stone floors hot beneath her bare feet, her mother's hands like iron around her shoulders. She remembered the shrieks of the wounded echoing off the cliffs, and the moment her father chose death over surrender, vanishing into the burning tower. Her mother carried her and her younger sisters to Nobunaga's camp, where the conqueror accepted their lives as trophies. They were taken to the castle at Azuchi, the glittering heart of Nobunaga's new order, a place of silk screens and foreign curiosities, where Cha-Cha grew up among the daughters of the men who had killed her father. She learned to bow, to smile without revealing fear, to walk as though floating. Her mother remarried Shibata Katsuie, Nobunaga's general, and for a time the world seemed steady. But when Nobunaga was betrayed and burned at Hanaji in 1582, chaos returned like a wave breaking over stone. Shibata and Katsui rose against Hideyoshi and were crushed. Oichi chose death, sealing herself in the flames at Kitanosho Castle, while Cha-Cha and her sisters were pulled away screaming. She was 13 when she entered Hideyoshi's orbit, a living relic of the Azai bloodline he had extinguished. He placed her in his harem as a political prize, another jewel in the crown he was forging from the wreckage of Japan. She became his concubine, later his favored consort, and bore him 2 sons, one of whom died young, the other who now slept beside her at Fushimi, the last beating heart of the Toyotomi name. She had learned what it meant to survive in a world made of men's ambitions, to erase your own desires, to become the vessel for another's legacy. It was not love that had kept her alive. It was the discipline of silence. While Cha-Cha endured the gilded prison of Hideyoshi's court, Mitsunari climbed its labyrinth with quiet ferocity. He became the governor of Sawayama Castle, then one of the 5 commissioners, Gobugyo, the supreme administrators of Hideyoshi's realm. He rationed grain, audited the flow of silver, built roads and canals, kept the entire Toyotomi machine humming like clockwork. The warriors despised him. He refused to drink with them, refused their swaggering camaraderie. He punished theft with mathematical indifference, as though morality were another column in a ledger. But Hideyoshi valued him beyond gold. Mitsunari had no lust for conquest, no family ambitions, no web of allies to appease. He was pure utility, a blade of intellect without a hilt. In 1592, when Hideyoshi hurled his armies across the sea to invade Korea, Mitsunari became the unseen pillar of the campaign. He orchestrated the flow of men and supplies across the straits, keeping hundreds of thousands alive through sheer precision. But success bred resentment. The frontline generals, Kato Kiyomasa, Fukushima Masanori, loathed him, claiming he meddled and undermined their glory. They conspired to kill him even then, their swords drawn in a council room until Tokugawa Ieyasu intervened. It was the first time Mitsunari glimpsed the abyss between himself and the men who lived by the blade. He had saved their empire, yet they would slit his throat for pride. He returned to Kyoto with his face composed like porcelain, but something inside him hardened to steel. Cha-Cha watched these currents from behind her screens, her gaze detached yet penetrating. She saw the same arrogance in the warriors who jeered Mitsunari that she had seen in the men who destroyed her family. To her, he was not weak. He was dangerous in a way they could not understand. He did not lust for wealth or glory or even survival. He moved like a man who had already accepted his own death as long as order outlived him. And beneath her stillness, something else stirred, the faint recognition of a kindred exile. She, too, had been despised as an interloper, dismissed as a beautiful ornament, feared as a political liability. They were both strangers inside the Toyotomi Palace. He because he was too cold, she because she was too proud. But they had one thing the others did not. They owed Hideyoshi everything, and therefore they would die for his son. The years curled inward like smoke. As Hideyoshi's health waned, Mitsunari's work grew frantic. He built fortresses, hoarded rice, audited every ledger in the empire. Cha-Cha bore the growing weight of Hideyoshi's expectations, paraded as the mother of the future. She smiled through ceremonies, through the endless kneelings and gift exchanges, even as her heart withered from isolation. They passed each other in corridors, two shadows sliding along opposite walls, never speaking, never acknowledging, yet each aware of the other's gravity. When Hideyoshi finally died in the 8th month of 1598, the fragile equilibrium shattered. Mitsunari saw the pieces of the empire scattering like dice across a board. Cha-Cha saw the eyes of the daimyo turn toward her son, like hawks sighting prey. Their separate paths converged in that single instant, drawn together not by affection but by necessity. He would become her blade of ink. She would become his symbol of purpose. It was not love that bound them, nor friendship, nor even trust. It was something colder and more absolute. Both had been raised in fire, and both had survived by becoming unyielding. Now they stood as the last walls of a crumbling house, holding up a roof that the world was already trying to tear down. And somewhere deep in the quiet place where ambition becomes faith, they both made the same silent vow. The child would live, even if they did not. The winter after Hideyoshi's death fell like iron over the land. Kyoto's gardens withered beneath frost, and the air turned so brittle that even whispers seemed to crack. The Toyotomi court, once a roaring furnace of ambition, became a cavern of muted echoes. Men walked softly through Fushimi as though stepping among tombstones, their armor creaking like old wood, their faces carved from stone. They spoke of loyalty, of duty, of mourning their departed master, but their eyes glittered with calculation. Each carried a private map of the future in his mind, and in the center of each map stood the same obstacle, a boy in a silk cradle and the woman who held him. Cha-Cha watched them from behind her screens, her gaze still and cold. She had once been surrounded by attendants and courtiers who bowed deeply as they passed, but now their eyes flicked toward Tokugawa Ieyasu's rising shadow. They smiled too widely, knelt too quickly, spoke her son's name too softly. The Council of 5 Elders, meant to serve as guardians until Hideyori came of age, was already hollowing from within. Maeda Toshiie, the only elder who had truly loved Hideyoshi, lay dying in Kanazawa. Uesugi Kagekatsu stayed distant in the snowy north. Mori Terumoto, named the titular head of the Toyotomi Regency, was quiet and elusive, his words like drifting smoke. And in that vacuum, Ieyasu moved with the patience of a glacier, slow yet unstoppable. Mitsunari felt the shift like a sickness under his skin. He remained at Fushimi, moving between the archives and council halls with the same meticulous precision as before. But the air around him had changed. The other magistrates whispered when he passed. The warriors no longer concealed their contempt. Kato Kiyomasa openly sneered at him in court, his hands resting on the hilts of his twin swords like a promise. Fukushima Masanori spat his name like a curse. They had always resented him, but Hideyoshi's authority had caged their hatred. Now the cage was gone, yet Mitsunari refused to retreat. He buried himself in ledgers, issuing orders with cold efficiency, collecting taxes, storing rice, auditing the flow of gold. He told himself that structure could save the world, that if every beam and pillar were reinforced, the Toyotomi edifice would endure long enough for Hideyori to grow. But each day, his power thinned like ice beneath the sun. The soldiers obeyed him reluctantly, the bureaucrats avoided his gaze, and even his allies began to stand a little farther away when he entered a room. At night he sat alone in the Sawayama compound, the lamp hissing softly, ink pooling black on the brush tip. He mapped alliances like battlefields, tracing lines between daimyo names on thin paper. He saw clearly what others pretended not to see. Ieyasu was gathering threads of power with invisible hands, drawing them slowly into his fist. He offered protection to nervous lords, settled their disputes, arranged marriages, forgave old offenses. His retainers filled Kyoto's streets, their banners snapping in the wind, their smiles polite and sharp. Even the air seemed to bend toward him. Mitsunari's mind circled the problem like a hawk trapped in a cage. He could not oppose Ieyasu openly. His own faction was too weak, too divided. But if he waited, the boy's claim would rot like fruit left in the sun. Every moment of hesitation was a nail in Hideyori's coffin. He could feel time slipping like water through his clenched fists. Cha-Cha sensed it too, though she showed nothing. She rarely left her quarters, moving through the palace like a ghost. The attendants brought her trays of food that she barely touched. She spent hours sitting in the garden even as frost glittered on the stones, her robes pooling dark around her like the wings of a crow. She had learned long ago that survival depended on becoming unreadable, yet inside she burned with a cold, quiet fury. She had lost her father, her mother, her clansmen, her homeland. She would not lose her son. At night she walked the empty halls of Osaka Castle, where she had moved with Hideyori after Fushimi fell silent. The fortress loomed over the city like a mountain of black stone, its white plastered towers glaring down like watchful eyes. It was the last monument to Hideyoshi's impossible dream, a dream built from peasant dust and hammered into empire. Cha-Cha drifted through the echoing chambers, past murals of tigers and dragons, and felt like the sole living soul inside a tomb. The Toyotomi court that had once buzzed like a hive now felt hollow. The generals who had pledged their lives to her husband's vision were carving it up like scavengers picking clean a carcass. In her solitude, she began to watch Mitsunari more closely. He visited Osaka often, striding through the gates with his thin shoulders rigid, carrying scrolls tucked like blades under his arm. He never looked at her directly, but she could feel his eyes on Hideyori, calculating, measuring, planning as though the boy were a fortress to be fortified. He spoke in clipped tones to her stewards, demanding reports, reallocating stores of rice and silver, redrawing garrison schedules. He was building something, though she could not yet see its shape. What struck her was not warmth, but relentlessness. He never wavered. While others laughed at banquets and courted favor, Mitsunari moved like a man walking alone across ice, eyes fixed on a distant shore only he could see. He seemed to grow thinner by the week, his face drawn tight over his bones, yet his presence cut sharper. She realized with a kind of cold shock that he feared nothing. Not the mockery of his peers, not the danger of Ieyasu's wrath, not even death. His only fear was failure. And so, slowly, she began to regard him not as a nuisance, but as a weapon. By the first spring after Hideyoshi's death, the fragile mask of unity finally cracked. Maeda Toshi succumbed to illness, leaving Ieyasu the undisputed senior among the five elders. He wasted no time tightening his coils. He moved his armies into the Kanto with imperial approval, summoned the lords of Kyushu and Tohoku to Kyoto for consultations, arranged the marriage of his daughter to Hideyori himself, an offer laced with poison, for it would make the boy a branch of Tokugawa rather than a trunk of Toyotomi. Mitsunari opposed it, quietly but absolutely. He argued that Hideyori's blood must remain untainted, that the Toyotomi legacy could not be bound beneath Tokugawa. The council ignored him. Even the other Toyotomi magistrates flinched from his stance. They wanted peace, survival, safety. He wanted principle. To them, he was beginning to look like a madman. Rumors began to seep through the corridors like smoke. That Mitsunari plotted to poison Ieyasu, that he schemed to exile Kato and Fukushima, that he sought to place himself as regent and rule through the boy. None of it was true, yet each whisper stuck to him like tar. The warriors sharpened their blades in the open now when he passed. Fukushima spat on the floor. Kato muttered that he would slit Mitsunari's throat before letting him steal the realm. And in the cold center of this tightening snare, Cha-Cha stood perfectly still. She did not defend him. She did not speak his name. But she watched him with a gaze as sharp as glass. She saw that he had become what she could not: active, defiant, willing to be hated. She needed such a man. Her son needed such a man. And so, without words, she began to shield him, not publicly, but invisibly, allowing his letters to pass through her stewards unimpeded, ordering her servants to obey his directives without question. She lent him the silent weight of her position, even as the court turned its back on him. It was then, in the flickering space between survival and ruin, that Mitsunari made his choice. He would no longer try to bend the court. He would bypass it. He would gather the lords who still feared Ieyasu's rising son, Ukita Hideya in Bison, Mori Teramoto in Choshu, Wasugi Kagekatsu in Echigo, and bind them into a Western coalition strong enough to strike down Tokugawa before his roots sank too deep. He would build a wall of men around Cha-Cha and her son, a living fortress to preserve the Toyotomi blood. He knew the risk. He knew that one betrayal could shatter it all, that the Western daimyo were jealous and brittle, that their loyalties were bound by fear more than faith. He knew that if he failed, his name would be ground into dust and his family annihilated. But to Mitsunari, these were numbers, not doubts. Risk was only a variable. The equation still promised survival, if he could solve it in time. As he rode from Osaka one gray dawn, the moat waters rippling like molten lead beneath the bridge, he glanced back once at the towering black silhouette of the castle. High in its keep, Cha-Cha stood at a window with her son in her arms, their robes bright as autumn leaves against the shadowed stone. The wind stirred her hair like a banner. She did not wave. She did not nod. But her stillness radiated something that pierced him more deeply than any word. He turned his horse and vanished into the mist, his resolve hardening like iron cooling in water. From that moment, he ceased to be a mere magistrate. He became a gambler of history. In Cha-Cha, silent and unmoving in her high tower, became the axis of the storm he was about to unleash. Spring came to Osaka like a wound reopening. The cherry trees bloomed pale and trembling along the castle's moats, their petals drifting into the black waters like fragments of forgotten prayers. Inside the walls, the air was thick with unease. Courtiers moved quickly and spoke softly, their silks whispering as if afraid to stir the sleeping dragon coiled at the heart of the realm. That dragon had no name now, only a face, round and delicate, framed by the soft hair of a boy not yet 6 years old. The name Hideyori passed through the halls like a fragile relic, a reminder of an empire already fading into legend. Cha-Cha stood at a high window, watching the petals swirl over the inner courtyard. Below, soldiers drilled in the pale light, their armor clattering like distant thunder. She felt nothing of spring's renewal. Each blossom seemed to her another fleeting breath, another moment stolen from the jaws of inevitability. She had endured the death of her clan, the fires of Kitanosho, the suffocating pomp of Hideyoshi's court. But this stillness was worse than all of it. It was the stillness before a landslide. Far to the east, in the wide plains of the Kanto, Tokugawa Ieyasu was gathering his strength. He spoke softly, promised stability, wrapped himself in the mantle of guardian to Hideyori. Yet his army swelled, his coffers overflowed, his spies slipped through the provinces like oil. Each week brought another daimyo's quiet oath to Edo. The balance of power tilted, grain by grain, toward Tokugawa. Mitsunari felt it like a crack spreading through glass. He had tried to resist through the old channels, petitions, decrees, edicts from the Council of Elders. But the council was dust now. Mori Teramoto sent only evasive letters. Wasugi Kagekatsu remained in the snowy north, cloaked in silence. The other magistrates bowed to Ieyasu's emissaries. Even the court in Kyoto had begun to speak the Tokugawa name with a tone of weary acceptance, as if history had already chosen. So Mitsunari made his choice. He would not wait for history to choose. He would seize it by the throat. Through the damp spring months he rode ceaselessly, slipping from castle to castle under false banners, his retinue small and silent. At Okayama he bent Ukita Hide to his cause, appealing to his pride as one of Hideyoshi's adopted sons. At Hiroshima he courted the Mori, wrapping flattery around veiled threats, hinting that Ieyasu would strip their fiefs if they hesitated. He sent secret envoys to the Wasugi in Echigo, urging them to rattle their swords in the north to draw Tokugawa's gaze. He summoned the remnants of the Toyotomi bureaucracy to Sawayama and filled its dark halls with maps, manifests, and coded letters, building a spider's web of commitments. Each pledge was thin as silk. Each could snap without warning. But Mitsunari wove them with the care of a man sewing his own shroud. He promised land, gold, honor, currencies he barely controlled. He whispered of duty, of vengeance, of preserving the Toyotomi flame against Tokugawa's encroaching shadow. And beneath it all, he promised something colder, that if they stood with him and lost, he would take the blame. Their names would be spared. His would be burned. The strain hollowed him. By early summer, he looked like a ghost wrapped in court silks, his face drained of color, his voice clipped and dry. He slept little, ate less, lived on ink and resolve. Yet his obsession lent him a terrible gravity. The more Ieyasu's star rose, the more Mitsunari seemed to defy it by sheer will, as though his refusal to yield might bend the world back into alignment. Cha-Cha watched the transformation with growing unease. Mitsunari came to Osaka often now, striding through the audience halls with his scrolls like weapons, speaking in low, urgent tones to her stewards. She never summoned him directly, but she always knew when he was near. The air tightened, the servants fell silent, the castle itself seemed to hold its breath. At first she had welcomed his vigilance. He had been the only one who moved while the others stood frozen in fear, the only man who still saw her son as a sovereign rather than a bargaining chip. But as the weeks passed, his eyes changed. The calm precision that had once defined him gave way to a feverish light. He spoke less of defense and more of war. He began referring to lords by their troop counts rather than their names, as if people were pieces on a board. She saw in him something she recognized too well, the same consuming flame that had devoured her father, her uncles, even Hideyoshi himself. It was the fire of men who believed they could bend the world by force of will. It burned bright, but it burned everything. She tried to warn him once, indirectly through a trusted steward. The words were careful. The Toyotomi legacy must endure, but not through ruin. The message returned unread, the paper folded sharply, untouched by ink. That night she walked the ramparts of Osaka Castle alone, the wind cold in her hair. The city stretched below in darkness, its lamps flickering like a scatter of stars. She thought of her childhood at Odani, of watching her father stand defiant on the battlements as Nobunaga's guns roared from the hills. She had been too young to understand his pride, only old enough to remember the aftermath. The blood on the stones, the silence of the courtyards where children no longer played. Pride had killed her father. Obsession had killed her mother. And now Mitsunari was walking the same path, dragging her son's destiny behind him like a banner into fire. Yet she could not stop him. He did not move in her world of silks and ceremony. He moved in the realm of shadows and steel, where letters were daggers and alliances were snares. She could only watch and wait and pray that his fire would not consume the boy she had sworn to protect. By midsummer, Mitsunari's web was complete. He had bound the Ukita, the Mori, the Uesugi, the Konoshi, the Otani, and dozens of lesser lords into a fragile coalition. They called themselves the Western Army, though they had no central command. Only Mitsunari's frantic vision stitching them together. Mori Terumoto agreed, reluctantly, to serve as the nominal head, lending the aura of his ancient house while staying safe in Hiroshima. Mitsunari would command in practice. When the news reached Osaka, Cha-Cha sat long in silence. The cicadas screamed in the heat outside, drowning the world in their shrill dirge. She pictured the banners gathering on distant fields, the supply trains snaking through the valleys, the drums pounding like distant thunder. She saw the same dream gleaming in Mitsunari's fevered eyes that she had once seen in Hideyoshi's, the dream of shaping the world by sheer audacity. But she knew what Mitsunari did not. Dreams were brittle. The stronger they burned, the faster they shattered. She rose from her cushion and crossed the chamber to where Hideyori played with painted blocks, stacking them into small castles only to knock them down again. He laughed each time they fell, the bright, unbroken laughter of a child who had never seen death. She knelt beside him, touching his soft hair, and felt a tremor pass through her hands. He was too small for this world of swords and banners, too small to carry the weight of a dying empire. Outside, the first banners of the Western Army were already unfurling on the summer winds. Mitsunari rode among them like a man possessed, thin and pale as parchment, his eyes fixed on a horizon no one else could see. He did not look back toward Osaka. He did not see the woman standing in the high tower, her robes stirring like dark waves, her gaze following him with a mixture of hope and dread. In her heart, Cha-Cha whispered the truth she could not speak aloud, that he was no longer building a fortress around her son. He was building a pyre, and if he failed, the flames would not stop at him. They would climb the black walls of Osaka and devour everything she had left. Yet still, she let him go, because there was no one else, because the boy needed a shield, even if that shield shattered, because she knew that in this world, sometimes the only way to protect life was to wager it. And so the Western Army marched into history, and the shadow of destruction lengthened across the land. The summer of 1600 bled into autumn with the heavy stillness of a held breath. Roads baked to dust beneath the sun, then sank to black mud under sudden rains, as if the land itself could not decide whether to burn or drown. Across the western provinces of Japan, banners began to bloom like wounds on the hillsides. Mitsunari's army gathered in restless knots, samurai polishing their spears in the heat, ashigaru sleeping under half-collapsed tents, horses stamping at the smell of thunder on the wind. The air was thick with the smell of iron and wet earth, the scent of war ripening. Cha-Cha felt it in the stones of Osaka Castle. The great fortress thrummed faintly, as if the coming violence had set its bones humming. Messengers arrived each dawn, mud-caked and hollow-eyed, their armor streaked with the dust of half a dozen provinces. They knelt before her stewards, murmured reports, and vanished like smoke. She rarely received them herself, but she read every scrap they brought. The words blurred together, troop movements, rice requisitions, whispers of defections. The Western Army was moving east in great slow arcs, coiling toward a single point, though no one dared speak its name aloud. Sekigahara. It was only a shallow valley in Mino province, a place of mist and rice paddies, known for nothing but its crossroads. Yet all the roads of Japan now seemed to lead there, as if history itself were drawing them together like iron to a lodestone. Mitsunari rode at the center of it, a thin figure swallowed in layers of armor and silks, his eyes sunken but burning. He had raised an army of nearly 80,000 men, Ukita Hideyi's proud banners from Bisen, Otani Yoshitsugu's scarred veterans from the north, Konishi Yukinaga's Catholic spearmen from Kyushu, Shimazu Yoshihiro's grim warriors from Satsuma, and countless lesser lords bound together by oaths, debts, or fear. They called him commander, though few said it without a curl of the lip. He was no general in their eyes, no scarred veteran of fields soaked in blood, but a bureaucrat in armor, a man who counted rice as others counted heads. He knew their contempt. He felt it like knives against his back as he rode among their ranks. But he did not care. He had not raised this army to win their respect. He had raised it to stop Tokugawa Ieyasu from swallowing the world before Hideyori could walk it. He drove them east with the cold precision of a ledger, each division moving on schedule, each supply train mapped like veins through the land. The effort hollowed him. He slept sitting upright in campaign chairs, ate in silence, spoke only to issue orders. He no longer felt hunger or fatigue, only the relentless forward pull of necessity. Every mile they advanced tightened the knot around his heart. He could almost see Ieyasu's shadow ahead of them, vast and silent, waiting. In Osaka, Cha-Cha watched the slow march through the reports that flooded her chambers. Each parchment reeked of sweat and ash, each stamped with the seals of men she had never met yet, now held her son's fate in their calloused hands. She spread the scrolls across her tatami floor in the pale light of dawn, the painted tigers on the walls seeming to crouch closer as she read. She traced the movements with her fingertip like someone touching the threads of a spider's web, and each tremor of doubt in the ink sent a shiver through her. Her attendants whispered of victories, small fortresses surrendering without a fight, Tokugawa garrisons scattering at the Western Army's approach. But she found no comfort in them. She knew victories were as fragile as blossoms. She had seen castles fall in hours, dynasties vanish between heartbeats. She had been a child when Odani burned, a girl when Kitanosho crumbled, a young woman when Nobunaga's palace turned to smoke. She had walked through too many ruins to trust the sound of drums. At night she wandered the outer ramparts while the city slept, the wind dragging loose strands of her hair across her face. The torches along the walls burned low, their light thin and flickering against the dark. She would stand for hours staring east across the black sea of rooftops toward the invisible battlefield. Somewhere beyond those hills, Mitsunari was marching, and she could not decide whether to fear more for his life or for what he might do if he lived. She thought often of Hideyoshi in those nights. He had marched like that once, when he was still young, when the world trembled under Nobunaga's banner. He had burned with the same impossible certainty that now burned in Mitsunari, that belief that the world was clay and could be reshaped by hands willing to bleed. And Hideyoshi had reshaped it, had seized it from chaos, had forged it into empire. But even he had left nothing behind but bones and echoes. She wondered if Mitsunari knew that. She wondered if he cared. The heat broke in early October. Cold rain swept across the provinces, turning the roads to rivers of black mud. The Western Army slogged through it, their banners soaked and heavy, their armor rusting in streaks. Mitsunari rode among them like a revenant, his face expressionless beneath his helm, his hands steady on the reins. He had begun to move as if he no longer inhabited his body, as if he had already left it behind, and was guiding it from some distant vantage beyond exhaustion. The reports that reached Osaka grew darker. Tokugawa's Eastern Army was closing from the north and east, sweeping like a tide through the central provinces, crushing or bribing the wavering lords along its path. Mitsunari's carefully stitched coalition began to fray at the edges. Some daimyo stalled, claiming sickness or poor roads. Others sent secret messages to Ieyasu, hedging their bets. Cha-Cha read the signs in the phrasing of their letters, in the subtle slackness of their seals, and felt her stomach twist. She had lived her entire life in the space between loyalty and betrayal. She knew that space too well. Hideyori was only 7. He still played with painted horses on the tatami, arranging them in perfect rows and knocking them over with his palms, laughing each time they fell. He did not understand that the men marching under his father's banners were gambling their lives on a dream that might vanish before he grew old enough to remember their names. He did not see the shadow of annihilation stretching across the horizon toward him. Cha-Cha saw it clearly. It loomed behind her every waking thought. It haunted her sleep as dreams of fire and collapsing stone. She woke each dawn with her heart racing, half expecting the castle to be burning around her, the air filled with the screams she remembered from Odani. She could feel history circling like a hawk, and her son was a rabbit in the grass. She thought sometimes of calling Mitsunari back, of sending a secret order commanding him to turn his army away before it was too late. But she never wrote it, because if he returned in defeat, if the Toyotomi name was broken without a fight, the boy would be devoured even faster. There would be no hesitation, no reason for Ieyasu to delay. The Toyotomi blood would be wiped away like chalk in rain, and so she remained silent, watching from her fortress as Mitsunari carried her son's destiny toward the edge of the blade. By mid-October, the Western Army reached the mist-cloaked valley of Sekigahara. The mountains loomed like dark teeth around it, their forests dripping with cold rain. The ground was soft and treacherous, the rice fields half-flooded, the air heavy with fog that swallowed the banners after only a few paces. It was a place that seemed to belong to no one, as if the land itself had withdrawn to watch what was coming. Mitsunari surveyed the valley from the saddle, his breath steaming in the chill air. He placed Ukida's banners at the center, Otani's scarred warriors on the southern slopes, Shimazu's grim men in the north, and Kobayakawa Hideaki, young, ambitious, unpredictable, on the heights of Matsuo to the east. To the far south, the Mori army lingered near Nangu, their strength vast, yet their loyalties veiled. Mitsunari's plan was clear and sharp. Hold the valley, let Ieyasu charge into the killing ground, then crush him from all sides. It was perfect on paper. It always was. In Osaka, the autumn winds howled around the black towers of the castle. Cha-Cha stood in the highest keep, staring into the storm clouds that rolled in from the east. She imagined the valley, the wet mist curling between the hills, the armies crouched like wolves in the fog. She imagined Mitsunari sitting alone in his tent, tracing lines across a map with steady hands, convinced that precision could bend the world. She closed her eyes and saw only fire. She did not pray. She had stopped praying long ago. The gods had never answered her before. She only stood silent, the cold creeping through her robes, and whispered one thought into the dark, that if the Western army broke, if Mitsunari fell, the next fire would come here, and somewhere beyond the horizon, hidden in the fog of Sekigahara, the storm was waiting. Dawn came to Sekigahara like the slow lifting of a shroud. The valley lay drowned in fog, thick and pale as curdled milk, curling through the paddies and low hills until the earth itself seemed to vanish. The air was damp and cold, beating on the lacquered armor of 80,000 men crouched in silence, their banners sagging with dew, their breath rising in pale plumes. The world felt suspended, as if even time were holding its breath. Mitsunari stood on a small rise, a strip of wet cloth tied around his brow beneath the iron helm. The mist soaked his robes, seeped into his bones, but he did not move. Before him, the Western army lay arrayed like an intricate design etched on water. Ukita Hide's 30,000 at the center, their red and white banners stirring faintly. Otani Yoshitsugu's scarred veterans to the south, crouched on the slopes behind their bamboo stakes. Shimazu Yoshihiro's grim spearmen, crouched to the north like coiled snakes. Kobayakawa Hideaki's 15,000 poised on the wooded crest of Mount Matsuo to the east, their banners still furled. And, farther to the south, beyond the fog, Mori Terumoto's vast force idle near Nangu, their intentions as silent as stone. Across the hidden valley, Tokugawa Ieyasu's eastern army waited, nearly 90,000 strong, their ranks packed tight on the western plain, their cannon and arquebuses glimmering faintly through the mist. Mitsunari could not see them, but he could feel them, vast and patient, like a great beast crouched in the fog. He closed his eyes and pictured the battle as he had drawn it on parchment 100 times. Ieyasu would advance into the valley, pressing against Ukida's line. Otani would sweep down from the south, Shimazu from the north, and Kobayakawa would plunge from Mount Matsuo into Ieyasu's exposed flank. The Mori would descend from Nangu to cut off the retreat. The jaws would close, and the eastern army would be crushed like grain between millstones. It was clean, elegant, inevitable. But the world was not parchment. The first musket volley cracked from the mist just after the 7th hour. The sound ripped the silence like tearing cloth, followed by the thin, ragged screams of men struck unseen. Then the drums began to pound, and the fog convulsed as bodies surged forward through the mud. The battle came alive all at once, chaos blooming like fire under ice. Ukida's line met the eastern advance head-on, the crash of spears and swords shuddering through the valley. The ground turned to sucking black sludge beneath their feet. Men slipped and vanished under the tide, trampled before they could rise. The mist boiled with the roar of conch shells, the blast of horns, the thunder of hooves. Gunfire spat in ragged bursts from behind bamboo screens, smoke twisting upward like ghostly serpents. Mitsunari's banners snapped above the din, his orders cutting through the clamor like chimes. He moved among his retainers with eerie calm, dispatching riders, adjusting lines, sealing gaps before they widened. He watched the currents of the fight with cold, calculating eyes, seeing not men but vectors, numbers, pressure points, and for the first hour, the pattern held. Ukida's center pushed the eastern vanguard back into the mire. Otani's flanking force swept down from the south, their arquebuses firing in deadly rhythm. Shimazu's veterans held firm to the north, silent and immovable as basalt cliffs. For a fleeting moment, the jaws began to close. Then Mitsunari glanced toward Mount Matsuo. Kobayakawa's 15,000 stood motionless in the mist, their banners furled, their drums silent. They watched the slaughter below as if they were spectators, not participants. Mitsunari's heart clenched. He had gambled everything on them. He had trusted that youth's hunger for glory would outweigh his fear, that the promise of reward would bind him tighter than the threat of ruin. But Kobayakawa did not move. His hesitation hung like a dead weight over the battlefield, dragging the momentum down with it. Mitsunari sent messengers galloping through the mud, their horses lathered white, but none returned. The fighting grew wilder, the screams sharper, the lines fraying under the strain. Otani Yoshitsugu, half-blind and racked by illness, urged his men forward with hoarse cries, holding the southern slope like a dying cliff. Ukida's soldiers, soaked in blood and rain, began to waver under the pounding of Tokugawa's cannon. And still Kobayakawa waited. Far to the south, Mori Teramoto's vast force remained rooted in place near Nangu. Kikawa Hiroya, commanding their forward division, refused to move. He stood calmly beside his banner, arms folded, his men watching him with unreadable faces. Mitsunari could not reach them, could not shake them from their stillness. It was as if half his army had turned to stone. Then the thunder changed. A new sound rose beneath the roar of drums, the rolling crash of arquebus volleys from the eastern heights. Mitsunari wheeled his horse toward Mount Matsuo and saw a movement through the thinning mist. Kobayakawa's banners had unfurled. They were charging, but not toward Ieyasu. They plunged into the exposed flank of Otani's line like a blade through flesh. Muskets flashed, spears drove, the western banners crumpled like paper. For an instant, Otani's men held, their commander shouting from his palanquin, his face drawn and pale. Then the weight of betrayal broke them. The southern slope dissolved into screaming chaos as Kobayakawa's men hacked through their former allies, and the shock rippled outward like a wave striking glass. Wakisaka Yasuharu's division turned their guns on their own comrades. Ogawa Yoshikatsu's banners wheeled and struck the rear of the western lines. Akaza Naoyasu and Kutsuki Motosuna followed, their men cutting down stunned allies as they fled. The western formation collapsed from within, the jaws snapping shut on empty air. Mitsunari felt the shape of the battle shatter in his mind, the elegant geometry breaking into shards. The valley became a whirlpool of mud and blood, men hacking at anything that moved, banners vanishing into the churn. Ukida's center crumpled under the renewed Tokugawa assault. Shimazu's grim veterans broke and fled into the northern hills. Otani Yoshitsugu, surrounded and betrayed, ordered his standard torn down and plunged his blade into his own throat. The fog lifted as if to reveal the ruin. By noon, the western army was gone. Mitsunari rode through the wreckage in a daze, his horse staggering, the mud sucking at its legs. Bodies lay twisted in the fields, their armor black with rain and blood. Broken banners flapped in the wind like torn memories. He could hear nothing but the thin rush of his own breath and the distant crackle of musket fire as Tokugawa's men hunted the stragglers. His plan, his years of preparation, his faith, his very soul, all lay scattered and trampled into the mud of Sekigahara. He turned his horse south and vanished into the hills as the sun broke weakly through the clouds. Behind him, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood on the field amid the dead, silent and smiling, his hands folded calmly as if he were surveying a garden. In Osaka, the day passed without weather. The sky hung low and gray over the black towers, the air still and sour. Cha-Cha felt it before the messengers arrived. She felt it in her bones, a hollow snap like the breaking of a thread stretched too far. She was walking the inner garden when her steward appeared at the edge of the path, his face blank as carved wood. She did not speak. She did not need to. That night she sat alone in her chambers, the lamps guttering low, the painted tigers on the walls crouching in the wavering light. She thought of Sekigahara, of the mist rising to reveal a field of corpses, of Mitsunari's thin hands clenched on empty reins. She thought of all the men who had died screaming in the mud for the dream of saving her son. She thought of her son asleep in the next room, his breath soft, his world still unbroken. The silence pressed against her like water. She could hear her own heart. She had known this was coming. She had feared it from the first moment Mitsunari marched away. Yet the reality of it sank into her like cold steel. The Toyotomi name had been broken in a single morning. The Western army was ash. The Eastern sun was rising, and nothing stood in its path. She did not weep. She had no tears left. She only sat in the dimness, her hands still in her lap, and felt the world begin to turn away from her. Outside, the autumn wind scraped dry leaves across the stone, whispering like distant laughter. The field of Sekigahara lay still beneath the gray light of dawn, a shallow basin of churned black mud and twisted bodies. The fog that had hidden the living now draped itself over the dead like a burial cloth. Crows picked silently at the sprawled shapes, their wings black flashes against the pale sky. The banners were gone, cut down or trampled, their bright emblems ground into streaks of colorless rags. Nothing moved but the wind. Far to the west, Mitsunari rode through the hills like a man made of smoke. His armor was spattered with mud, his robes stiff with dried blood, his horse staggering beneath him with each step. He had fled when the jaws closed, slipping through a break in the lines as his army disintegrated around him. He did not remember choosing to flee, only the sudden instinct to move, to survive, to keep going as everything he had built fell away. For 3 days he rode through the rain, following forgotten forest tracks, drinking from ditches, his mind a hollow echo. Villages turned their gates against him. The peasants hid when he passed, clutching their children, their eyes wide with fear. They knew the Western army had been annihilated. They knew Tokugawa's retribution was coming, swift and merciless, and they would not risk being found giving shelter to its architect. He passed burnt hamlets where the air still smelled of charred wood and horseflesh, where corpses hung from blackened beams, the work of Eastern patrols scouring the countryside for stragglers. Sometimes he heard distant drums or saw the flash of armor through the trees and turned aside like a hunted animal, slipping through gullies and reeds. His retainers scattered one by one, vanishing into the woods without a word, until only a few half-starved attendants trailed behind him, their eyes hollow. At night he sat by dwindling fires, staring into the embers while rain hissed on the leaves. The silence roared in his skull. He could still see the valley, the fog tearing open, the sudden bloom of betrayal ripping through his ranks. He had built the Western army like a clock of flesh and steel, every gear measured, every spring tuned, and watched it explode in a heartbeat. He thought of the men who had followed him out of duty or desperation, and now lay rotting in the mud. He thought of Otani Yoshitsugu dying on the southern slope, his body folding around his blade. He thought of the boy in Osaka, still playing with wooden horses on the tatami, unaware that the world he was meant to inherit had been buried under that mud. Something inside Mitsunari had cracked at Sekigahara. He could feel it, a thin line through the core of him, leaking everything he had ever believed. He had once thought duty could hold the world together, that if he measured precisely enough, planned carefully enough, sacrificed fully enough, the structure would stand. But duty had not saved them. Logic had not saved them. The world had chosen chaos, as it always had. By the 4th day, his horse collapsed under him. He walked after that, his sandals dissolving in the mud, his feet bleeding, his body trembling from hunger. He moved like a shadow slipping between trees, no longer thinking of rescue or victory, only of vanishing. He wanted to disappear from the map, from memory, from the flow of time that had swept everything away. He reached Mount Ibuki as a cold wind swept down from the north, cutting through the trees like knives. He hid in a peasant hut for a night, shivering beneath a torn straw mat, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. He dreamed of paper tearing. At dawn, Tokugawa scouts found him. They came silently from the trees, black-armored and faceless, their spears glinting in the gray light. His attendants dropped to their knees without a word. Mitsunari did not resist. He sat where he was, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the dirt floor. He felt strangely light, as if his body were no longer his own. They bound his arms, lifted him to his feet, and led him down the mountain. They paraded him through the villages on the way to Kyoto. The peasants lined the roads to see the fallen architect of the Western Army, the man who had defied Tokugawa and lost. They threw stones and rotten fruit. Children spat at him. He walked barefoot in the dust, his robes tattered, his hair matted to his skull. He kept his eyes down, not from shame, but from exhaustion. In Kyoto, they placed him in an iron cage and set it on a cart, dragging it through the streets so the people could see that the Toyotomi guardian was broken. He sat cross-legged behind the bars, unmoving, while the crowd jeered. The city that had once bowed to his edicts now howled for his death. The air stank of incense and sweat, of triumph and fear. In Osaka, the news arrived like a blade slid silently under the skin. Cha-Cha received it without flinching. She sat in her inner chambers, her face a mask of porcelain as the steward knelt before her and recited the words. Mitsunari had been captured alive. He was being brought to Kyoto for judgment. The Tokugawa banners now controlled the roads to the capital. The Western Army no longer existed. When the steward withdrew, the silence of the chamber closed around her like water. She sat motionless for a long time, listening to the faint, distant cries of gulls over the harbor. Her hands lay still in her lap. Only her breath betrayed her, thin and shallow, like someone breathing through a wound. She thought of Mitsunari as he had been the last time she saw him, thin and pale, his eyes burning with that fierce, impossible certainty. She had feared that fire, had known it would consume him. Now it had, and it had left nothing but ash. The castle seemed to have shifted subtly around her, as if its stones had exhaled. The courtiers walked with lighter steps. The servants spoke with careless voices. The tension that had gripped the Toyotomi court for 2 years had dissolved overnight. Only she seemed to notice that what replaced it was not relief, but hollowness. The empire Hideyoshi had built, the dream Mitsunari had tried to preserve, had crumbled into silence. At night she walked the ramparts alone. The autumn wind whipped her robes and tangled her hair. The city below was quiet, the lamps flickering in the alleys like dying stars. She looked east toward Kyoto, toward the place where Mitsunari now sat caged, and felt a strange stillness seep into her. It was not sorrow, it was not anger, it was the cold acceptance of someone who has seen the pattern of fate too many times to fight it. She thought of all the men who had died trying to shield her son. She thought of the boy asleep inside the keep, his small body curled under quilts, dreaming of nothing but play. She thought of how small he was against the weight of history pressing down on him, how alone he would be now. She had once hoped Mitsunari might hold that weight long enough for the boy to grow strong enough to bear it. Now he was gone, and the weight remained. In Kyoto, they stripped Mitsunari of his robes and dressed him in coarse linen. They fed him thin rice gruel and chained him in a cold cell beneath the palace. He sat with his back against the wall, his legs folded, his eyes half closed. The guards said he never spoke. He seemed emptied out, as if the part of him that had cared for survival had been left behind in the mud of Sekigahara. He waited there while Tokugawa Ieyasu sealed his victory. The Eastern Army swept through the central provinces, forcing the surviving Western lords to kneel. Ukita Hideye was captured and sent to distant exile. Konishi Yukinaga was hunted down in Kyushu and dragged to Kyoto in chains. The Mori were stripped of half their lands. The Shimazu fled back to the southern tip of Kyushu. One by one, the pillars of the Toyotomi world toppled. Only Osaka Castle remained, black and brooding over the autumn plain, the last fortress of a dying name. Cha-Cha moved through its halls like a spirit, her face calm, her robes immaculate, her voice cool and measured. She spoke rarely, and when she did, the courtiers bowed low and stepped back as though chilled by her breath. They whispered that she had gone cold, that grief had turned her to stone. They did not see the storm that coiled beneath her stillness, the endless, silent scream that she kept buried behind her eyes. She had lost her father to pride, her mother to despair, her husband to ambition, and now Mitsunari to loyalty. She had walked through the ruins of every man who had tried to protect her. She wondered how much longer anyone could try before there was nothing left to protect. The wind rose over Osaka, rattling the shutters, scattering dead leaves across the stone courtyards. The season was turning, and somewhere in the darkness of Kyoto, Ishida Mitsunari waited in his cell, listening to the distant clatter of the city, as if the world were already erasing him. The sun rose pale and cold over Kyoto on the 6th day of the 11th month, its light brittle as thin ice. The city stirred before dawn, a low murmur of feet and voices echoing between the gray wooden eaves. Shops remained shuttered, temples silent, yet the streets filled with people. They came like a tide, drawn by the promise of spectacle, wrapped in layers of drab winter cloth, their breath steaming in the chill. Soldiers lined the avenues, their armor dull under the washed-out sky, their spears angled like rows of withered reeds. At the heart of the city, near the river, stood the platform. It was built of rough pine planks, stained dark where blood had soaked into the grain from executions past. A scaffold rose behind it with 3 broad wooden crosses, their beams worn smooth by the ropes of countless deaths. The smell of wet earth and cold iron hung in the air. The crowd gathered thick around the square, pressing close, their murmurs blending into a single low hum like bees in a frozen hive. Shortly after the 7th hour, the first prisoners appeared. They were brought from the palace dungeons under heavy guard, their feet bound, their arms tied behind them with coarse rope. Konishi Yukinaga came first, his once bright robes stripped away, his face hollow and gray. Then Ankokuji Eke, the monk general of Aki, walking with his head lowered, lips moving in silent prayer. And last, Ishida Mitsunari. He emerged from the shadowed gate like the remnant of a burned painting, thin and colorless, his hair loose around his wasted face. The coarse white prison robe hung on him like a shroud. His eyes were calm, flat as stone, revealing nothing. The crowd surged forward with a hiss of breath. Stones flew and curses spat like sparks. He did not look at them. His gaze remained on the ground before his feet, his pace steady, unhurried, as if he were simply walking to another meeting. The guards led them up onto the platform and forced them to their knees. The air stilled. Even the murmuring of the crowd thinned to a brittle silence. The executioner stepped forward, his blade wrapped in white cloth, his face impassive. Konishi Yukinaga went first. He bowed once, eyes closed, lips moving in a final prayer to the foreign god he had served. The sword flashed and his head rolled across the boards with a dull thud. A low moan rose from the crowd like wind through reeds. Ankokuji Eke followed, his prayer breaking into a thin cry as the blade struck. Blood sprayed across the weathered planks, dark and steaming in the cold air. Then it was Mitsunari's turn. He straightened his spine, his thin shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains beyond the city roofs. He did not bow. He did not close his eyes. The wind stirred his hair across his face as he knelt, his hands bound behind him, his body still as carved wood. The sword came down in a clean silver arc. For an instant, the world seemed to pause. Then his head fell forward, and the body toppled like an empty vessel. The crowd erupted. They screamed his name like a curse, threw mud and stones, jeered as the guards lifted the severed head by its top knot and displayed it to the sea of faces. The blood dripped black onto the boards. The soldiers carried it on a spear through the streets, past the crowded markets and silent temples, to the Sanjo Bridge over the Kamo River, where they nailed it high above the passing traffic so all could see the fate of rebels. The head stared down at the city with half-lidded eyes, the mouth slightly open, as if whispering something only the dead could hear. The crowd drifted away as the light waned, their voices fading into the winter dusk. The platform was washed with buckets of cold water until only dark stains remained, and the city resumed its breathing as though nothing had happened. Far to the west, Osaka Castle stood black and silent against the sullen afternoon sky. Cha-Cha knew before the messengers arrived. She felt it ripple through the air like the echo of a distant bell. She was sitting in the upper keep, watching the gulls wheel over the harbor, when the steward entered and knelt wordlessly. He laid the scroll on the tatami before her, its seal cracked, the ink smeared by hurried hands. She did not touch it. She did not need to. The room seemed to dim around her. The sound of the gulls faded. The painted tigers on the walls crouched deeper into their shadows. She sat unmoving, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the gray sea met the gray sky, her face pale as bone. She thought of Mitsunari as he had once stood in the audience hall. Thin and taut as a bowstring, his voice cold and precise, his eyes burning with that strange, unbearable purpose. She thought of how he had moved like a man walking alone across ice, never looking down, never doubting the strength of the surface beneath him. She thought of how she had feared him, distrusted him, relied on him. And now he was gone, erased in a single stroke, his body discarded, his name already curdling in the mouths of courtiers as they rehearsed new loyalties. The silence inside her was vast. It spread outward until it seemed to fill the castle, smothering the shuffle of attendants, the whispers of stewards, the soft clatter of servants beyond the screens. Even the air felt heavier, as though the walls had sunk closer together. She rose slowly and walked to the far window. The city sprawled below, its streets thin threads of pale smoke curling upward into the cold. The wind hissed along the tiles. Somewhere within the keep, her son was laughing, high and bright, the unshadowed laughter of a child who knew nothing of heads on spikes, of fields filled with corpses, of dreams snapped like twigs. Her hands trembled against the window frame. She had known this was coming. She had known from the moment he rode away that he would never return. But knowledge did nothing to blunt the hollow weight that settled in her chest. Mitsunari had been the last wall between her son and the rising Tokugawa tide. Now that wall had fallen, and the sea was pouring in. That night she wandered the upper corridors alone, her robes trailing over the dark lacquered floors. The castle was silent, its vast chambers echoing like a mausoleum. She passed the great hall where Hideyoshi had once held banquets, where drums and laughter had shaken the golden screens, and found it dark and cold, the air tasting of dust. She stood in the center of the empty hall for a long time, listening to the nothing. Mitsunari had died as he had lived, unloved, unyielding, unremembered except as a caution. The world would not mourn him. History would carve his name into the stone of Sekigahara as the architect of failure, the man who had thrown an army into the teeth of inevitability and broken it. They would call him arrogant, foolish, blind. They would not see what she had seen, that he had carried the Toyotomi dream on his narrow shoulders until it crushed him. And now he was gone, and the dream was dying, and her son was alone. Outside, the winter wind clawed at the eaves, rattling the shutters. The lamps flickered low, their flames shrinking to pale threads. Cha-Cha turned away from the darkness of the hall and walked back into the labyrinth of the castle, her steps soundless, her face blank. Somewhere beyond the walls, in the distant dark of Kyoto, Mitsunari's head still gazed down from the bridge, rain streaking its hollow face, the eyes dull, the mouth open as if caught mid-breath. By morning, even the crows would not look at it. Winter folded itself over Osaka like a heavy black wing. The storms came down from the northern sea, dragging gray clouds that crushed the sunlight and scoured the castle walls with needles of frozen rain. The great black towers of Osaka Castle loomed through the sleet like the bones of some ancient beast, its white plaster scars streaked with meltwater, its gold leaf dulled to the color of dying embers. The banners of Toyotomi Hideyori still fluttered from its battlements, but they hung heavy and sodden, their once bright crests bleeding ink into the wet wind. Within the fortress, time thickened into silence. Cha-Cha moved through the empty corridors like the last living figure in a forgotten painting. The vast halls that had once roared with Hideyoshi's laughter now held only the hollow echo of her footfalls on polished blackwood. The great golden screens were veiled in dust. The banquet halls stood dark, their lacquered tables cold. The few remaining courtiers spoke in whispers, their voices thinning like smoke. They bowed deeply when she passed, their eyes averted, as if afraid her gaze might turn them to ash. She ruled without titles, without ceremony, without proclamation. There was no other choice. The boy was still too young to wield anything but the wooden sword he carried as a toy. The stewards who had survived the purge of Sekigahara now moved only at her word. She signed the edicts, appointed the chamberlains, chose the tutors, allocated the stipends, commanded the gates. Her seal was pressed on every document, though her name was never spoken in them. The Tokugawa permitted it, or rather tolerated it. They had not yet found cause to move against her. The boy was the last living son of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu was too cautious to risk igniting the embers before they cooled. Instead, he wrapped his patience around her like a noose. Envoys arrived from Edo with soft voices and long scrolls, their words smooth as oiled wood. They spoke of harmony, of reconstruction, of the new peace that would endure for 10,000 years. They brought gifts, lacquer boxes, brocaded bolts of silk, white horses with gilded bridles. They bowed until their foreheads brushed the tatami, their smiles still as porcelain masks. Cha-Cha accepted everything and gave them nothing. She understood the theater. She had lived inside it too long not to. She let the envoys admire the castle's glittering murals and the boys' solemn little bows. Let them see what they wished. A grieving widow tamed by sorrow, her claws folded, her fire spent. When they left, she had their gifts carried to the storerooms and sat alone in the audience hall, staring at the black lacquered floor until her reflection blurred into darkness. At night, she walked the outer walls, the wind slashing her hair loose from its pins. The city sprawled below like a drowned constellation, its lamps flickering dimly in the mist that rose from the river. Beyond the harbor, the sea merged with the black horizon. Somewhere far to the east in Edo, Tokugawa Ieyasu was building his new capital from the bones of her husband's dream. He was drawing the lords of Japan into his orbit like moss to a pale, cold sun. He moved slowly, methodically, inevitable as the turning of seasons. She hated him, but it was not a hot hatred. It was glacial. It was the hatred of stone for the tide. Hideyori grew like a vine in a sealed room, stretching silently toward a light he could not see. He passed his 7th, 8th, 9th year within the black walls of Osaka, his world bounded by gardens of white gravel and clipped pines, by the echoing halls where his voice came back to him as if from another century. He wore silks embroidered with his father's crest, bowed perfectly to the chamberlains, recited the classics with a clear, high voice. He rarely laughed. Cha-Cha watched him with a gaze that cut the air like a blade. She had him drilled in calligraphy, tactics, poetry, etiquette, archery, the art of war. He memorized the campaigns of Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, the stratagems of Sun Tzu, the genealogies of the lords who now bowed to Tokugawa. She kept him wrapped in iron discipline like lacquer over fragile wood, knowing that if he cracked, the world would pour through the gap and destroy him. He sometimes asked about his father, and she told him he had been a man who sees the world. He sometimes asked about Mitsunari, and she told him nothing. Yet Mitsunari lingered in the castle like a ghost. She felt him in the cold spaces between breaths, in the rhythm of her own steps through the corridors where his sandals had once whispered. She saw his shadow flicker at the edges of torchlight in the archive chambers, where he had hunched over scrolls, his brush flying, his face taut as a drawn bow. She heard his voice in the scrape of quills on paper, in the soft hiss of ink spreading on parchment. Sometimes she caught herself pausing at a door as if expecting him to step through, thin and precise, his eyes already calculating the distance between ruin and survival. He had failed. He had died as the world laughed. Yet she could not erase him. He had been the last man who believed, with the full force of his soul, that her son mattered. That knowledge gnawed at her. It burned like a coal lodged in her chest. She had not loved him, not even liked him, but she could not forget that he had gone to the scaffold to buy her son a little more time. Time. That was all he had bought. The Tokugawa grip tightened year by year. Ieyasu was named Shogun in 1603, and the heavens seemed to seal the decree with silence. The court at Kyoto bowed. The lords of the north and east pledged their banners. The roads filled with Tokugawa patrols. New castles rose on distant hills like teeth. A net of law and gold spread across the provinces, binding the country in invisible chains. Osaka became an island. The merchants still crowded its markets. The black towers still clawed at the clouds. The Toyotomi crest still gleamed on the gates, but beneath the surface the city curdled. The lords who had once feasted in its halls now came only to whisper, slipping in through side gates, their palanquins curtained, their eyes sharp with caution. The flow of rice tribute thinned. The air grew brittle with waiting. Cha-Cha felt the noose drawing tight. She spent long nights in the great map chamber, staring at the painted mountains and rivers while the lamps guttered low. The walls were lined with shelves of old ledgers, their paper yellowing, their ink fading like memories. She stood motionless for hours, her face pale above her black robes, her hands clenched in her sleeves. She told herself she was waiting, that was all, waiting for her son to grow, to become strong enough to reclaim what had been taken. But in the deep silence of those nights, she sometimes admitted what she would never speak aloud. She was afraid, not of the Tokugawa, of time. Time was the true enemy. It was erasing them even as they stood. Each year, her son became a little more polite, a little more careful, a little less a child, and a little more a figure shaped by fear. Each year, the Toyotomi crest faded further from the world beyond these walls. Each year, Mitsunari's name sank deeper into the mud of Sekigahara until only she remembered that he had once burned like a star. She feared that by the time her son was ready, there would be nothing left to claim. And so she built a fortress of silence. She let no word of dissent escape the walls. She banished anyone who spoke carelessly of the past. She cloaked the boy in ritual and discipline until he gleamed like a blade. She wrapped herself in mourning silks as if they were armor. Outside, the Tokugawa envoys smiled and waited. Inside, the castle darkened year by year, its vast halls growing colder, its gardens emptier, until it no longer felt like a palace at all, but like a mausoleum built for the living. Cha-Cha became its ghost, and Hideyori its reliquary. And somewhere in the cold stone chambers of her heart, Mitsunari's shadow lingered still. Not as a man, not even as a memory, but as a question. Had he been wrong to fight, or had he only been too early? The wind howled along the battlements, rattling the gold tiles, carrying the smell of snow down from the northern hills. The black towers stood against the darkening sky like clenched fists. And deep within them, a boy rehearsed the gestures of sovereignty before an audience of ghosts. The years hardened around Osaka like ice sealing a black lake. By the time Hideyori came of age, the Toyotomi name had become less a dynasty than a rumor, a faded echo clinging to the cold stone of their last fortress. The world beyond the moat belonged to Tokugawa now. The shogun's banners rippled from every coastal stronghold, every mountain castle, every road where armored patrols marched in tireless rhythm. Edo pulsed like a new heart in the east, its streets swelling with merchants and soldiers, its coffers deep as the sea. Yet on the western plain, Osaka Castle still loomed against the sky, black and defiant, its vast moats gleaming like cold mirrors, its white towers rising tier upon tier like clenched teeth. Within its walls, time had warped. The castle was a sealed world, cut off from the flow of history, wrapped in ceremonial stillness. Cha-Cha reigned at its center like an obsidian statue. She had grown thin, her face sharpened into elegant planes, her black hair streaked with silver that gleamed like frost under the lanterns. She wore mourning robes still, refusing the bright silks the stewards sometimes dared to offer, as if color itself had become treason. She rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was low and smooth, carrying through the echoing halls like the glide of a blade. Hideyori moved through her world like a prince raised inside a tomb. He was tall now, grave-faced, with his father's sharp features muted by an aura of solemn caution. He bowed perfectly, spoke sparingly, smiled rarely. He held audiences in chambers lined with golden screens painted with cranes and pine trees, while beyond the screens the guards stood in ranks like carved figures. His followers knelt before him with ritual reverence, yet behind their stillness he sensed the tautness of men waiting for a signal that never came. Because Cha-Cha would not give it, not yet. She had spent the years since Mitsunari's death waiting, sharpening her son in silence, preserving the illusion of Toyotomi's sovereignty until he could bear its weight. She had hidden her fury behind perfect ceremony, her grief behind marble stillness. She had let the Tokugawa envoys bow and flatter, let them bring gifts and make offers, let them leave believing she was broken. But inside her, something had never stopped burning. She had seen the Toyotomi Empire reduced to bones, seen Mitsunari's head nailed above the bridge, seen the world crown Tokugawa as its new son, and still she had endured. She had endured for one reason only, so that when the time came, her son would stand against that sun and cast a shadow. In the 14th year of Keicho, the Tokugawa gave her the excuse she had been waiting for. A monk named Hokoji carved a bell for a new temple in Kyoto, and on its bronze surface were etched words that could be read as a curse upon the shogunate and a blessing upon the Toyotomi. Ieyasu seized on it like a vulture on carrion. He accused the Toyotomi of treason, of plotting rebellion, of conspiring to plunge Japan back into war. He sent an ultimatum: dismantle Osaka Castle and disband your forces, or face annihilation. Cha-Cha read the scroll in the silent great hall, her face as still as the black lacquered floor. Then she burned it. The castle awoke like a beast roused from hibernation. The moats were dredged and deepened until they gleamed black and bottomless. The outer walls were rebuilt into sheer cliffs of stone, storehouses filled with rice and powder and salted fish. Smiths hammered through the night, their sparks spilling like fireflies across the courtyards. Ronin flocked to Osaka from every corner of the country, masterless men drawn by the scent of defiance. They came ragged and hungry, their armor dented, their swords nicked. Yet they knelt in the snow before Hideyori and swore to die for him. Cha-Cha watched them kneel, her expression unreadable. By winter, more than 100,000 men thronged within and around Osaka Castle. Their campfires ringed the black walls like a crown of smoldering embers. The Tokugawa banners gathered beyond the horizon, their ranks vast and patient, their drums throbbing faintly through the frozen air like the heartbeat of a leviathan. The siege of Osaka had begun. The Tokugawa army came like winter incarnate. Snow hissed from the gray sky, swallowing the plains in white silence as their cannons boomed, shaking the earth. Hurling stones the size of oxen against the walls, the ground trembled like the skin of a dying beast. Smoke crawled along the battlements, thick and acrid, stinging the eyes of the defenders as they loosed their arrows and fired their matchlocks into the white haze. Cha-Cha watched from the highest keep, her black robes whipping in the icy wind. The stones shuddered under her feet with each cannon strike, dust sifting from the beams like old ash. Below, the Toyotomi banners snapped and streamed crimson in the gale, defiant against the snow. The air reeked of powder and frozen blood. For weeks the fortress held. The moats turned to black slush clogged with corpses, the stone walls pitted and scorched, yet the defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew there was nowhere to retreat. The Tokugawa lines inched forward through the blizzard, their trenches filling with frozen dead. The cannon roared until the air itself seemed to splinter, yet the black towers stood. Ieyasu, frustrated, offered peace. He promised to spare Hideyori if the castle's outer defenses were dismantled. Cha-Cha agreed. In the biting cold of early spring, the siege ended. The Tokugawa withdrew, their banners vanishing into the mist. Laborers filled the outer moats with earth, tore down the outer walls, left the core of the fortress standing naked and exposed on the plain. The defenders disbanded. The campfires guttered out. The city exhaled. But Cha-Cha had not surrendered. She rebuilt in secret through the summer, gathering Ronin again, stockpiling arms, fortifying the inner walls. Hideyori trained with sword and bow from dawn to dusk, his young face set in grim lines. The castle bristled with quiet fury. A black volcano crouched above the city. In the 5th month of 1615, the Tokugawa returned. This time they came like a tidal wave. 200,000 men swept across the plain, their banners blotting out the horizon, their cannon thundering until the sky shook. The city quaked under the bombardment. The inner moats boiled with fire. The white towers shattered one by one, their beams shrieking as they fell, the air screaming with splinters and stone dust. The defenders fought from ruin to ruin, their swords red to the hilts, their screams lost in the roar. The courtyards became lakes of blood, the air glowed red and black. Cha-Cha walked the shattered halls like a figure carved from obsidian, her hair unbound, her robes scorched. She moved through clouds of ash and sparks, past walls split open to the gray sky, past the crumpled bodies of men who had once sworn they would die for her son, and had. The castle groaned around her like a dying giant, its stones cracking, its timbers burning. In the final hours as the last tower collapsed, She climbed the stairs to the keep. The floor shook under her feet, beams sagging, smoke clawing the air from her lungs. She found Hideyori kneeling before the household shrine, his armor dented, his hands trembling. He looked up at her with the calm of someone who has glimpsed the end of his name. The Tokugawa were breaking through the gates. The screams were closer now, rising through the crackling of flames. The sky outside was black with smoke, red with sparks. Cha-Cha knelt beside her son. She placed one hand on his shoulder and felt the frail pulse of his life beating like a trapped bird. They had nowhere left to run. The last defenders set fire to the inner chambers. The flames rose with a low, hungry roar, devouring the silk hangings, the cedar beams, the lacquered screens painted with gold cranes and black pines. The heat surged through the keep like the breath of an opened furnace. Cha-Cha led her son into the fire. The tower of Osaka Castle went up in a single towering bloom of orange light. It lit the night sky like a second sun, its sparks spiraling into the dark like the souls of the dead rising. The Tokugawa soldiers stood in the courtyard staring upward, their armor glowing red in the inferno, their faces pale. The roar drowned everything. When the smoke cleared days later, nothing remained but black stone and white ash. The Toyotomi line was gone. The Tokugawa sealed their victory in silence. The ashes were shoveled into the river. The burned stones were left where they lay, cracked and silent under the sun. The black towers of Osaka would never rise again. And somewhere deep beneath that charred ruin, under the collapsed beams and shattered tiles, under the molten gold and the ashes of banners, lay the bones of a woman who had once been called Cha-Cha, and the boy who had once been called the heir of a man who sees the world. They were gone, but for years after, the people of Osaka whispered that on certain nights, when the wind blew from the west and the moon floated low over the plain, the charred stones of the old keep glowed faintly red, and a shadow walked its ruined ramparts, her robes trailing like smoke. Her gaze turned east toward Edo. They said she was waiting still, waiting for the world that had killed her to remember her name.